This is the Flowering of the Middle Ages, Week 7. Last week we had lectures on medieval Spain by Maria Elena Solino, and she told us about Islamic culture and politics in Spain and the policy of convivencia, not reconquest, in which really all the groups in Spain mixed together. And she showed us some medieval Spanish architecture and Arabic and Jewish poetry. We also heard a lecture last week on courtly love in southern France by Richard Armstrong, when he explained to us that there were so many languages in France. There were 7 or 8 or so languages, the main ones being Languedoc and Languedoc, the languages of southern and northern France. He also told us about troubadour poetry and the conventions of courtly love, and talked about the lover as a performing persona. Along with the courtly love went an idealization of women who were treated as feudal lords. And here we can see a few illustrations from those lectures. We can look at Islam and see how widespread it was in the world, and here it is in medieval Spain as part of the wider world of Islam. And here are the kingdoms of the Muslim kingdoms of Spain, which Maria Elena Solino made the point were all divided up. I've shown them all orange here, but they're actually independent, and that helped to actually break up the kingdoms and to make it more easily conquered. And here we can see the progress of the incursion of the Christians into Muslim Spain in 1210 and in 1360. Here is some of that Muslim architecture that she showed us. This is the Mosque of Cordoba. And here are some views of the Alhambra. Here is the Court of the Lions. And here is the interior of the Alhambra to remind us of what that architecture looked like. This is a portrait of King Alfonso the Wise, who had a court of courtly love where poetry was written in Spain. Moving to France, we have in France, again, a situation where politically it's all broken up. Along with all the different languages of France, France is shattered into different provinces. This is southern France, the area where courtly love was really concentrated, where the troubadours were. And here is a ballad singer accompanying himself on the violin. This is a scene of courtly love with the lady and her knight, who is her lover, or at least her lover in wishful thinking, at least. And here is a court of love in Provence, Provençal, which were formed in those areas. This is a French trouvère writing the music that we heard about. Simultaneously to the rise of courtly love literature in southern France, prosperity fostered a huge outburst of building activity, particularly in the south of France. And so we see at the very same time that this courtly love literature was being written, buildings are springing up all over France, and especially southern France. Inspired by Roman traditions, they developed their own styles of architecture. Romanesque, which are experiments showing a lot of creativity, and Gothic, a satisfying pattern repeated over and over again. The keys to success were the modules or bays of the cathedrals and the Islamic-inspired pointed arches. So now we're going to have a lecture this week by Nora Laus of the College of Architecture, and she's going to tell us about medieval architecture. And so we'll have Nora now.
I teach architectural history at the College of Architecture here at the University of Houston. I am an architectural historian by training, and I also studied architecture before I studied architectural history, and my specialty is the Middle Ages. I have been working on medieval material for quite a few years, mostly in France. So what you're going to see tonight is going to be mostly, I'm afraid, French architecture. And I'll start with that, with a sort of an apology right away, pseudo-apology, just to tell you that our history is not subjective, or history is not objective. History is very definitely subjective. And I'm going to give you one sort of view, or one viewpoint of the history of medieval architecture. And somebody else who would come and talk to you would give you possibly another viewpoint. And because my own work has been mostly in France, you're going to see mostly architectural pieces, architectural history from France. The cultural renaissance, we'll start just first just with a little bit of a brief history. The cultural renaissance on which this course is focused is very much in evidence in the realm of architecture and architectural sculpture, which is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about architecture and monumental sculpture. Very much in evidence in the 12th and 13th centuries, as much as there is a renaissance of music, as much as there is a renaissance of literature. And we'll be focusing in the next few hours on Romanesque and Gothic architecture. Romanesque, first of all, what does that term mean? E-S-Q-U-E, Roman, R-O-M-A-N. Also, I should say briefly that I will try and spell all the terms. These might be new terms to you. Try to spell them as much as I can. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Romanesque, what does it mean? It means, E-S-Q-U-E in French means like. So it means something that's Roman-like. There were many Roman structural forms and Roman building techniques that were revived by medieval builders, especially in the 12th century, starting in the 12th century. The primary use, we'll see the primary use of stone vaulting. These are, a vault is a curved stone surface, and medieval builders revive stone vaulting techniques of the Romans. We'll also see how round-headed arches, semicircular arches, are used especially in the architecture between the years 1000 and 1140. Those are roughly the limits of the dates of Romanesque architecture, 1000 to 1140. Gothic. What is Gothic? Gothic is a word that was originally used in the 17th and in the 18th centuries to describe all of medieval architecture. Not only what we consider Gothic today, but the whole span of medieval architecture. And it wasn't until the 19th century that it came to be specifically referred to architecture and art between roughly 1140 and 1500. So Romanesque is from 1000 to 1140, and Gothic from 1140 to roughly 1500. And this is how the term is used today. This is how the word Gothic is used today when you're describing art or architecture. The term itself refers to a barbarian tribe, the Goths. The Goths were a barbarian tribe, a tribe of foreigners who attacked the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. And this was always meant, Goths were foreigners, and this term was always meant as a derogatory term. The Goths were enemies of the Roman emperors, and or the Roman emperors, the Roman citizens. And so this was always, this was a term that was devised first, it was made up first in the 16th century, and it was always a derogatory term. It was a negative term. The Goths were held responsible for the decline of Roman civilization. And the irony is, of course, that they really had nothing to do with the art and the architecture that was produced between 1140 and 1500. The Goths, by then they were long gone. They were long dead. This is just an overall derogatory, debasing term that was devised by Renaissance philosophers who rejected medieval architecture, who thought medieval architecture was bad. And this term has stuck. It's simply a term that has stuck with us over time. And sometimes I think we would be better off by calling Gothic architecture something else that is more meaningful, that has something to do with actually the style or the physical characteristics of Gothic architecture. For example, I don't know, the pointed arch style or something, something silly like that, or the flying buttress style. At least these are two architectural elements that are prominent in the style and that are meaningful. But I don't think that will happen. I suspect that Gothic is going to stick. So we have Romanesque and we have Gothic. We'll see that there is quite a bit of regional variety in Romanesque architecture, especially in France, where individual regions of the country begin to develop their own identities early in the Middle Ages. In contrast, Gothic architecture is a style that was born in one place. It's a style that was born in the area around Paris, what we call the royal domain, the area of the kings, the French kings. And Gothic architecture is much more homogeneous in character. It's much more unified in style than Romanesque architecture. And through the series of slides that I'll be showing you today, you'll be able to see how this is demonstrated. What about building typology? What kinds of buildings are we going to be looking at? The primary buildings that survive from the Middle Ages are, and you won't be surprised to hear this probably, churches. You've probably heard this many times before. Churches and buildings that are related to religious architecture, like cloisters or other monastic buildings. Why is this the case? The church had the most power. It had the most wealth. It could hire the best craftsmen. It could afford the finest materials. And obviously all of these things make a building that's going to last a long time. And churches have lasted through the centuries. And the churches really are the primary evidence for building that we have from the Middle Ages. We also know of fragments, we also have fragments of medieval royal palaces, king's palaces that still exist. There is a famous palace chapel in Paris. It's the palace chapel of Louis IX that's still standing. The palace itself is gone, but the palace chapel still exists. We also know of examples of residential architecture, houses, stone houses and timber houses. Wooden houses. Both of these kinds of examples of houses also still exist. But we can count them on one hand. There are very, very few of them. So for every 50 churches, there may be one house. So there's really not very many examples of residential architecture. Finally, there were towns that were built, whole towns, small towns that were built in the Middle Ages. These were often what we call bastides, or buffer towns. And we also know fortifications. There are also some fortifications that are left in Western Europe, especially in northern France and in England. But primarily we're going to be looking at churches and at religious architecture in general. Again, this might be a bit of a review, but you should also know, this is very important, you should also be aware that the church was the primary religious center, it was the primary social center, it was the primary economic center of the medieval city. It was the economic, social, and religious focus of life. Probably the most important goal in medieval life was salvation. And it was through the church that one attained salvation. Not only were churches built of the finest materials and with the best workers, but the most sophisticated architectural innovations took place in church building, and the greatest technological advances took place in church architecture. So stylistic innovations and technological advances took place in medieval architecture in church building. And this is where medieval architecture really holds its place in the whole entire history of building, is in religious architecture. And we see the overwhelming role of the church, especially in the architecture of the 13th century, we see this especially in Gothic architecture. I point this out because I don't think we really have an equally powerful institution in our world today. We don't have this kind of we don't know of anything that's as powerful as the church. Even the government in our society is not as powerful or not as prestigious as the church was. We live a much more heterogeneous existence today in the 20th century. Our lives are much more individualized. If you think about it, there's much more focus on personal life, on your private life, much less focus, especially in the United States, on communal life. And this is due to the legacy of the Renaissance philosophers, 15th and 16th century philosophers, who shifted the emphasis away from God, away from the church, and toward the human being, toward the individual. And this was continued in the period that we know as the Enlightenment, in the 17th and especially the 18th century, when there were great, very significant scientific discoveries that were made, and much more rationalistic philosophy was applied to religious, political, and social issues. This is a part of the Enlightenment legacy. So the Renaissance philosophers, Renaissance humanism, as well as the Enlightenment, really shifted the focus away from God, away from the church, and toward man. And this is we live in that kind of environment today. So in order to really appreciate medieval architecture, you sort of have to put on a different pair of shoes. You have to accept the prominence and the prestige and the power, both economic and social and religious power of the church. So if we could turn to the slides, I'd like to begin with a relatively quick and very general overview of the architectural precedence of the Middle Ages. What happens in architecture before the Romanesque period, before the Romanesque and Gothic period, before what we call the High Middle Ages. Just to give you a sense of the historical and the architectural context in which this building renaissance took place, because there really was a building renaissance. There really was a revival of large-scale stone building in the 12th century. And this is also, I'm also doing this because I'm also a great believer in the fact that architecture doesn't drop from the sky. Architecture, these great cathedrals just don't appear on the earth from out of nothing, from nowhere. So I'm going to try and give you a bit of a little brief history, as well as attempt to show you where we're going to be looking, what countries, we're going to be looking mostly at France, but what areas of France we'll be focusing on. To begin, I would like to explain briefly about the Roman Empire, because Romanesque is really a revival in many ways of buildings that were built in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire ruled over the entire Mediterranean basin. The entire Mediterranean basin, from the eastern side, this is unfortunately off the camera, what's called the Middle East today, Israel, Palestine, over across Egypt, North Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, all the way across here, across the Straits of Gibraltar. The Romans controlled the country of Spain, what we know as Spain today. The Romans controlled the country, what we know as France today. They controlled half of England, which is up off of this map here at the very top. Obviously all of Italy. The capital was here in Rome, in the center of Italy. And all of what's known as the Balkan Peninsula, with the former countries of Yugoslavia. All of Greece, the Asia Minor, what we know as Turkey today, all of this whole entire area, this whole Mediterranean basin, was controlled from Rome, controlled by the Roman emperors. The height of this empire was in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. And the major building programs that were commissioned all over the empire, all over all over the territory that was controlled by the Roman emperors, were, in general, large-scale public or civic commissions. Huge, massive, large buildings. And I'll show you a few of these in just a moment. In general, there's a certain continuity. There's a certain homogeneity in Roman architecture. A kind of building, a kind of public building that was built in Rome was likely to look very much like the kind of public building that was built somewhere here in Turkey or somewhere here in France. If you built a large public bath, the Romans bathed in large bath complexes, enormous public buildings. If you built a bath in Rome, it would look probably very much like a bath in one of the colonies of Rome. It's very cohesive kind of architecture that was produced by the Romans. Kinds of buildings they produced: basilicas. A basilica is going to be very important because it's going to be the focus of medieval architecture. The Christians are going to borrow the basilican building type, and I will explain the parts of a basilica in just a moment. They built baths, they built temples, huge amphitheaters, very similar plans and similar architectural solutions all over the empire. Before we look at some examples, I'll just point out that we have the map where we're going to look at the areas that we're going to look at today in today's lecture. We're going to look at different regions in France. We will look up here. We'll look at this area here in the northwestern corner, just on the English Channel, is known as Normandy. We will look at some architecture from this area right here, which is Burgundy, sort of northeastern France. We'll look at a very interesting piece of Romanesque architecture, Romanesque church from the southwest, which is known as Aquitania. I will show you one building from Germany. I'll show you one building from northern Spain. And again, in the beginning, I'll show you some examples from Rome. We'll look at one pilgrimage church. We'll look at one example of a pilgrimage church in France, right here. And I think that's probably it. We'll also have one example of the Cathedral of Durham from England. Italy remained very conservatively tied to its Roman and early Christian roots in the medieval period. So we're not really going to look at any architecture from Italy. Italian architecture is very conservative. All the interesting things happened in Northern Europe, happened in France, in England, and in Northern Germany. And I'll begin just by showing you a couple of examples. If we could look at the slides. Thank you. I'll show you a couple of examples of Roman architecture, just to give you an idea of the contrast, because I'm going to make certain parallels and certain contrasts later on. This is the ruins of a bath. This is the bath of the Emperor Caracalla in Rome. Caracalla, if you want to write, is C-A-R-A-C-A-L-L-A. Roman baths were huge, massive structures. They were built of brick and concrete. The Romans were masters of concrete. They invented concrete. Medieval builders do not use concrete. Medieval builders will build out of stone and out of brick, but not out of concrete. But the Romans were able to build these enormous structures. You can get a sense of scale, the proportional size of something. These are people who are standing here in the center of the slide. This is one of the several spaces in the bath. It was originally covered. It was originally covered by large vaults, and these vaults have all disappeared today. We see the springing of the vaults here. So these vaults would have made this space twice as large, twice as high. One large undivided space. And this was just one room of the baths. There were dozens of rooms in these bath complexes. And here's another slide of the same, a different space, one with a large semicircular apse on one side. These walls would have been covered with stucco and then with marble panels. These are all holes here that were used to attach these marble panels. So the interior wall would have been polished marble. The floors were all covered with mosaics, tiny little cubes of stone, and there's a fragment here that still remains in place. This is hard to see the color here, but it's a black and white and red mosaic, small pieces of stone, tiny 1 by ½ inch by ½ inch pieces of stone that were laid together to make the floor. Very impressive, massive, large spaces. Another example of a bath is located, of all places, in Paris, France. Paris was a Roman city. These are the Cluny baths, C-L-U-N-Y. And this is again one of the rooms of the bath. It's an important example because it's again unfortunately difficult to see here, but its vault remains in place. It had a large. I'll talk about vaulting in just a moment. It had a large barrel vault over the side here, and then one large, what we call a groin vault, over the center. And again, the interior walls would have been covered with marble, lit with these high windows, large windows at the tops of the spaces. There would have been torches of fire lighting the interior, and the whole space would have sort of moved or glittered in its original state. Monumental scale, this is important to remember, monumental scale, undivided open space, huge undivided open space. Nothing is compartmentalized. There's no interest in dividing up the space. And all of this was possible through the use of concrete. So, baths. Our next example from Roman architecture is the Basilica, B-A-S-I-L-I-C-A. A basilica is a building type. This happens to be the Basilica at Trier in Germany, T-R-I-E-R. This is the basilica known as the Basilica of Constantine. Constantine was the first Christian emperor. And this was his imperial audience hall. This is where Constantine, the emperor, had a throne inside this building. And he would sit on his throne, and his subjects would come and pay homage to him. And this was part of a large palace and was built in the 4th century, the early 4th century AD, when Trier was briefly his capital. The emperor moved around very often in the Roman Empire, and he would move around with all his retinue, and wherever he moved, that would be the capital. And briefly, the city of Trier, which is in Germany, Western Germany, was his capital in the 4th century. Again, it's a huge building. It's an enormous building. It's about, get a sense from the size of the cars, it's about 90 feet high, 90 feet tall, one large undivided space. Constantine had his throne in the curved part, this section right here. This section is called the apse, the A-P, spelled A-P-S-E. And the rest of the space was one large rectangular space where everybody else would stand and would pay homage to him. This is the interior, and this is the apse right here. So the emperor would have had his throne on the floor, on the ground, right below this space, below this curving space. And you should notice that there's an arch here. And there's an arch that separates the apse from the rectangular enclosure of the rest of the building. And this is what has come to be known as a Triumphal Arch, this arch right here. And it's a physical and a psychological barrier. It separates the emperor from his subjects. And Christians are going to take over this building type. Yes?
Yes, I have a question. I noticed that in the ceiling, how the ceiling is made, is that done for acoustics, or was that just common style?
No, that wasn't done. No, the question was whether the ceiling was done for acoustical purposes. And no, this is what we call a coffered ceiling, this kind of rectangular formwork or rectangular forms. And this is a wooden ceiling that's coffered. It's only for decorative reasons. The Romans would use coffering. They would make coffering out of concrete. And these recesses would be made out of concrete in order to lighten the weight, for structural reasons, in order to lighten the weight. But here, this is a wooden ceiling, and it's just an ornamental coffered ceiling. But that's a very good point, because these basilicas were most often covered with wooden roofs. They weren't vaulted. And the Christians are going to borrow this idea, borrow this typology, and you'll see that they also, their earliest churches are also covered with wooden roofs. So this triumphal arch is going to be also used, we'll see it used in Christian architecture, in medieval architecture, to separate the priest and the altar from the people who are visiting or who are participating in the Mass. This kind of building, the basilica, was used by the Romans for all different kinds of functions. They used it for law courts. They used it for markets. They used it for sort of philosophical discussions. It was basically an all-purpose kind of building. And it's the most neutral kind of building that the Christians are going to find to be able to take. It's a large congregational sort of meeting hall. And the Christians are going to be able to use this. This has no religious ideology attached to it, no Roman pagan religious ideology attached to it. And the Christians are going to borrow this building type to use for their churches. And I'll show you, if we could go back to the slides, I'll show you one example. This is an early Christian church, also in Rome. This is the Church of Saint Sabina, S-A-B-I-N-A. This is a basilica, but it's a basilica now used as a church. And what are the parts? This is important. We're going to get some vocabulary now. The parts of a basilica. First of all, this curving section, the apse. That's where the altar is going to be placed. That's where the most important piece of furniture from the church is going to be placed. The longitudinal space behind the apse, the central longitudinal space behind the apse, is called the nave, N-A-V-E. That's the central aisle of the church. There are lower sort of corridors on either side. There's one here, and there's one on the other side of the building as well. And these are called aisles, spelled A-I-S-L-E, not I-S-L-E. They're not little islands. They're aisles. So my students always spell this wrong. They spell nave, N-A-I-V-E, spell like naive, and they spell aisle like island. So I've learned to try and spell these things in lecture. So nave and lower aisles on either side. Above the aisles, you'll see that there's a row of windows. These are located high up in the wall of the nave, and they're called clear-story windows. C-L-E-A-R, story, S-T-O-R-Y. And that's because they actually clear the aisles. They're above the aisles. They clear the space of the aisles, and they're the windows that allow light. They're going to allow light into the nave of the church. This is a building that's covered by a wooden roof. The roof here is a gable roof. It's a roof that has a double pitch. And then the roofs that cover the aisles are called shed roofs, S-H-E-D, just like a shed in your garden. Yes?
I have a question. Were they many times building the churches north and south in direction so that the sun can go in through the windows from east to west?
No, they were usually building the churches in exactly the opposite direction. The apse was at the east, and the entrance was at the west. So the apse was facing the rising sun, and the entrances to churches are almost always going to be at the west. The facade, or the entrance, is always going to be on the west side. So, no, they weren't specifically. They were they're oriented, beginning already in the 4th century, towards the east. supposedly towards Jerusalem. If you're building a church in Western Europe, you orient it towards Jerusalem, because Jerusalem, of course, is where Christ was lived, where Christ was a missionary, and where he died. So those are the individual parts, individual sections. Oh, I also have this shows the center of the nave here, separated from the aisles by an arcade, A-R-C-A-D-E, which is a row of arches resting on columns here. All this interior was originally covered by marble. The marble floor still exists. You can see some of the reflections of the light on the marble. There were marble plaques that covered the wall here above the arcade as well. And the windows here are filled with stucco window frames that date from the 5th century. They're original window frames made out of pieces of stucco, which is sort of a very hard kind of plaster, with clear glass inside of them. And again, the apse here, curving apse, with the altar at the very east. If we could swing the camera back on me for a few minutes. This is all the early Christian period. This is all Roman early Christian, 4th, 5th centuries. Before we get to the Middle Ages, I just want to briefly review the history of the intervening centuries, because there's a lot of time between the 5th and the 12th centuries. What happens between the 5th and the 12th centuries? This is a long time period in which Roman architecture is essentially forgotten. Building techniques are lost, because what happens is that Rome falls. Rome falls to barbarian tribes. Rome is attacked by different tribes of barbarian invaders from northeastern Europe, and Rome eventually falls. It falls in the year 476. The Roman Empire collapses, and Roman architecture is essentially forgotten during this time. Building techniques are lost, and the architecture that's produced in the 6th, 7th, and early 8th centuries has a completely different character that's influenced by these invading barbarian tribes. This intervening, this slow decline of the Roman Empire begins already in the 3rd and 4th centuries. This is a period of instability in terms of economics, in terms of culture, in terms of politics. By the end of the 5th century, the Roman Empire was vastly reduced in size. There were civil wars. Groups of Romans get together and they begin to fight amongst each other. The city of Rome was attacked twice by invading barbarian tribes. Barbarian means foreigner, somebody from the outside, somebody who's not a Roman. This term originally comes from the word barbus, and a barb is a beard, and barbarians had beards. They weren't barbarian. Sorry, you have a beard. They weren't barbarian the way that we think of barbarian today, somebody who's crude and sort of unrefined or unsophisticated. They were simply foreigners. They were simply people with beards, and the Romans were clean-shaven. They didn't have beards. And so that's, this is where the term, it's what the term originally meant. Rome was attacked twice, in the year 410 and in the year, again, 455, by two different tribes, by Visigoths and by Vandals. All of these have these tribes have different names. They're all Germanic in sort of their cultural and national origin. All these tribes come from the direction of the Balkan Peninsula, from northeastern Europe. They invade the borders, the frontiers of the Roman Empire, and they sort of break down the homogeneity, the continuity, the cohesion of the Roman Empire. And they settle in different areas. The Anglo-Saxons, where do they settle? In England. Right? The Anglo-Saxons settle in England. If you've ever been to northern Italy, you might have gone to Lombardy. Well, Lombardy is named after the Lombards. These were the tribes of barbarians that came and settled in northern Italy. In France, it's the Franks. That's where France gets its name, from the Franks. They're this invading tribe. Burgundians. Burgundians come and settle in the region of France that's now known as Burgundy. And then finally also the Arabs. The Arabs were a constant threat in Western Europe. The Arabs moved from the south through North Africa and up through Spain and into France. And they were stopped. The Arabs were stopped in central France in a very important battle in the year 732, the Battle of Poitiers, in the sort of roughly almost the center of France. And this is very important because Arab influence in architecture doesn't go very much further than that. There's a lot of Arab influence in architecture in Spain and in southern France, but not in northern France. And that's because the Arabs were stopped. The advance of the Arabs was stopped. What are the consequences of all of this? Fall of the empire, the barbarian invasions. What this does is it fragments Western Europe. It fragments or breaks up the continuity, the cohesion of the Roman Empire. The tribes settled down. They established small states. And they ultimately formed their own constitutional governments. And these are the very rudimentary beginnings of Western European nations. This is how Western Europe was originally broken up into different nations. So if we could turn back to the slides. In the realm of art and architecture, what happens is we see a breakdown of the continuous tradition of Roman building. The barbarians don't know how to build like Romans. They try to build like Romans, but they don't know how. Really don't know how to do it. They don't have the techniques, and they don't have the materials. The architecture of this intervening period between the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Romanesque period, sort of from the 6th, let's say, to the 8th centuries, is known as the architecture, or is known as the period, quote unquote, of the Dark Ages. This is all relative. It's not really dark, but it's, again, a derogatory way of classifying it. Characterized by small-scale buildings, an example of which you see on the screen. This is a church in northern Spain, a small church in the town of Zamora, Z-A-M-O-R-A. It was built in the late 7th century. It's very different from the Roman buildings that we were just looking at. It's dedicated to St. Pedro, St. Peter. Relatively crude construction technique. The builders were building out of large blocks, but not very, in many cases, not very nicely cut blocks, roughly cut blocks, laid in rough courses. They had trouble keeping the courses horizontal here. This is a much smaller church than the Roman Basilica. Everything is toned down, tamed down in terms of scale. But most importantly, look at its composition. It's much more compartmentalized. It's made up of individual compartments or individual units instead of one large undivided space. And this is important because the concept of dividing space into units or into modules is really one of the keys to understanding and appreciating medieval architecture. This medieval architects are going to break up those big, huge Roman spaces into smaller spaces, into smaller individual units. At the end of the 8th century, you may already know this is just a review, but there is an attempt to reunify the empire. The Frankish king Charlemagne, who I'm sure you've heard of by now in this class, Charlemagne was able to unify all these heterogeneous little nations, quote-unquote nations of Western Europe, into another empire, what he called the Carolingian, what Charlemagne called the Carolingian Empire. And it's in this period, in the late 8th and early 9th century, that we really see the first medieval Renaissance. The 12th century Renaissance that this class focuses on is really the second Renaissance. The Carolingians already had a Renaissance. And I don't have time to show you any slides or talk about this in any great detail, but it's just to tell you that the Carolingians borrow literally from Roman vocabulary and from Roman construction techniques. What happens again, however, at the death of Charlemagne, everything falls apart once again. So Western European history is really the history of the rise of empires and the breakup of empires. The rise of empires, the breakup of empires. Not very different from what we see today. Not very different from the rise of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the Soviet Union. The rise of Yugoslavia, the breakup of Yugoslavia. We're going to see this continually again. This is very much somehow a part of human culture. So at the death of Charlemagne, Charlemagne dies in the year 814. The empire is divided. The balance and stability is weakened. And new tribes of invading people attack the frontiers, attack the borders of the empire, and again do the same thing that happened in the 5th and 6th centuries, contribute to the political, again, and cultural diversification of the Carolingian Empire. And we see a new sense of national or regional loyalties that develop in place of the Carolingian Empire. And finally, we're going to get to Romanesque architecture, because this is the point where these new regional loyalties are expressed in regional characteristics in art and regional characteristics in architecture. And we'll turn now to look at some early examples of Romanesque architecture. If we could look again at the slides. General characteristics first of Romanesque. Use of semicircular arches, round-headed arches. We'll see there are some areas of France where pointed arches are used, but for the most part, we're going to see these kinds of arches, round arches. Stone is the primary building material. Romanesque builders do not use concrete. They don't know how to make concrete in the 12th century. So they use local materials, which are primarily different kinds of stone. The buildings are generally heavy, very solid in appearance, in contrast to Gothic architecture. And in these first few examples that I'll show you, we're going to focus on the development of this modular system in design, which is what we call a bay system, B-A-Y, development of individual bays. And we're also going to focus on vaulting techniques. How did builders vault? How did they, these are the most ingenious, some of the most ingenious technical solutions appear, technological solutions appear in Romanesque architecture. A vault is the way that the architectural space was covered with stone, because we'll see Romanesque builders cover their spaces with stone usually, not wooden roofs. And vaulting goes hand in hand with the development of a repetitive spatial design. Two kinds of vaults. First one is called a barrel vault. This is a barrel vault. If you take a semicircular arch and extend it back into space, you will have a barrel vault. Somebody made a face. Take a semicircular arch and just extend it back. And a barrel vault is actually half of a barrel. A barrel is a round cylindrical form. A barrel vault is half of a barrel. A barrel vault, imagine this is all made of stone. It's heavy. Right? Stone is very, very heavy. It exerts a pressure. There's a force. The weight of all this stone exerts a force. And it exerts a continuous force all along the length. That's what these arrows mean here in the diagram. Continuous pressure, continuous force all along the length of the vault. The other kind of vault is called a groin vault, G-R-O-I-N. And it's very simply two barrel vaults intersected at right angles. If you take a barrel vault and turn another barrel vault 90 degrees, you get a groin vault. The intersection is a square. If the barrel vaults have the same diameter, the intersection then becomes a square. And the lines that are created, these lines here that are created in the vault, and we'll see these in just a few minutes, are called groins. In contrast to the barrel vault, the groin vault exerts a pressure. All the loads are directed towards points of support. It doesn't exert a continuous pressure along the length or along the side of the vault, but the loads, this is what these arrows imply, all the loads, the weight of the stone, the force of the stone is directed toward points. And this is important because then builders could open up the sides of the vault. Here it's going to be very difficult to open up the wall. If you cut away a lot of this wall, your vault is going to fall. But here it's going to be very easy. This section here has no structural role. So you could put a window here. You could put an opening here. It's going to be a way of manipulating the space. And this is a way of creating a bay system. This is going to become a module or a unit of space, a unit that's going to be repeated all in church, all along the length, usually the length of naves and the length of aisles in church architecture. The first building that we're going to look at is actually a monastery. It's part of a monastic complex. This is called Saint Martin, M-A-R-T-I-N. Saint Martin du Canigou, C-A-N-I-G-O-U. C-A-N-I-G-O-U. This is a church that's in the Pyrenees Mountains, and you can tell from the landscape it's located in a very isolated spot in the Pyrenees Mountains. And the church itself, we'll see, is one of the earliest examples of vaulted architecture. It was built starting around the year 1000 AD. So this is our first example of, one of the first examples of Romanesque that we're going to be looking at. Before I look at the church in detail, though, I just would like to talk about the monastery. Because the monastery is part of, or the church, excuse me, is part of a larger religious complex. A monastic complex or a monastery is a self-sufficient religious community. It's a group of individuals, a group of monks, a group of men or nuns, women, who decide that they're going to retreat from the secular world. They're going to retreat from the lay world, and they take communal vows. They agree on certain ways of living. They agree to follow a set of rules, and they live a communal life. Medieval monasteries were very often located in isolated areas like this, far away from any urban setting, far away from civilization, quote unquote. Often, almost always located near some kind of source of fresh water. In this case, it's, the mountains provide plenty of water. Very often you have rivers or streams. Very often there's arable land around the monastery. The monks will farm. They have their own animals. They have their own fields. They really try in the medieval period to live as self-sufficiently as they possibly can. So what are the parts of a monastery? Because the parts of monastic architecture are very similar all over Western Europe. The heart of the monastery is in the very center. Ironically, the heart is empty. It's the atrium. It's the open space in the center that's called the cloister. C-L-O-I-S-T-E-R. The cloister is an open atrium, or an open sort of central courtyard with lower wings around it, corridors all around it. And it was the place, the most private place for the monks, where they could meditate, they could walk, they could read the Bible in quiet seclusion. The church was located to the north of the cloister, and this is the church building right here with a tower, single church tower, and This is the church. You can see the little apse here just at the end of the church. Church is almost always located to the north, and that's to take advantage of the sun. So the cloister would get the sun. So here the sun comes into play. So there were very few heated spaces in the monastery. So in a monastic complex, you tried to take as much advantage of the sun as possible and try to heat, allow the sun to get to as much as possible this central cloister space. If the church was on the north side, the church roof would block the sun into the cloister. The east side of the cloister was taken up by usually 2 levels of buildings. The lower level usually contained communal rooms, contained, let's say, a chapter house where chapters of the rule were read, the monastic rule were read. It usually contained the only room that was heated, a warming room, the only room that was heated in the monastic complex. And then on the second level was the dormitory. Monks all slept together in one space. The dormitory was always located just next to the church because the monks would have to get up in the middle of the night to go and say Mass. So there was always, at least this was one convenience they had, that they didn't have to walk far. They could just, very often there were stairs that went directly from the dormitory into the church proper. Monks had to say often several Masses a day. Didn't matter if anybody listened to them or not. God was listening. So and their schedules varied, and sometimes they'd have to get up at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the middle of the night and I don't know how they did this. They didn't have alarm clocks, so I'm not quite sure how this was accomplished. If we move back, the south side of the cloister was usually taken up by the refectory, R-E-F-E-C-T-O-R-Y. This was the communal dining hall. But in this case, the monastery is located so close to this cliff that obviously there was no room to build here, and the refectory is located here on the west side. But these 3 parts, or 4 parts, church, cloister, dormitory, and sort of warming room and refectory are the main components of monastic architecture. If you go anywhere in Western Europe, you'll find these kinds of buildings. There were also other buildings here that were added later. There's a building here. There are other buildings here. This is still a functioning church. It's no longer a monastery, but this is still a sort of it's difficult to get to, so it isn't a parish church, but it is a functioning church. There is a priest here at this church, although it's not. There were no longer any monks who live here. There were almost always in monasteries rooms for visitors, for guests. There were sort of a hostel or a hospice. This is still the case. If you go to Europe today, you can go to a monastery and you can stay overnight, usually very often for free, sometimes for a small fee. This is part of sort of charity that monks were supposed to provide. If we look at the interior of this church, this is the interior of the church building itself. The church is composed of 3 parallel spaces. There's a central nave right here, and then 2 aisles on either side, one here and one here. Again, a typical basilican solution. This is taken from early Christian architecture. The central nave and 2 side aisles. Separated by columns and by piers. This kind of support has a rectangular cross-section, is called a pier. And a column is a single piece of stone, one carved long piece of stone is called a column. It's vaulted with 3 parallel barrel vaults. There's one here, there's one, you can't see it, it's up here over the nave, and there's one over the other aisle. 3 long barrel vaults. 2 problems here. This is an early experimental stage of vaulting development. obviously one problem, as I said in the diagram earlier, barrel vaults push out. They tend to push out right at their springing point, at their base, in this direction and in this direction. Right here it's okay because there's a barrel vault here. It pushes this way. This barrel vault pushes this way, and they counter each other. But what happens here? This barrel vault pushes out and wants to push the exterior wall out. So this wall has to be very thick. Exterior wall of the building has to be very, very thick, made up of a lot of stone, a lot of masonry in order to counter that, the thrust of this wall pushing out. And it cannot be opened very much, so there's very little light. You can't make many openings in this wall, or it's not going to hold anything up. The vault is going to push down, push out on these walls, and the vault will collapse. So this is an indication that this was an experiment. This is an experimental stage. This is an early stage of vaulting. If we look at another example, this is an example in northeastern France, in Burgundy. This is the Church of Saint Philibert, Philibert, in the town of Tournus, Tournus. We will see another example, a more sophisticated example of vaulting experiments. The church was built in several different phases, and I show you this view from the cloister just to show you how you can tell, if you go and visit a medieval church, how you can tell the different building phases. You can see from the color of the masonry. Masonry, when I say masonry, I mean stone. Any stone or brick is masonry. The changes that take place here, actually here, this is one section. This is the nave and the aisle. At a later date, a large, what we call narthex, or a porch, an entry space, was added. And this is this section right here. And you can see that the color of the masonry is slightly different. There were different builders. These were built sometimes 100 to 150 years apart. In this case, there were several different phases over 200 years. So you have one here. We have a second one here. It has different decoration, different ornamental techniques. Just one moment. And then there was a third phase. This is the west facade. These are the two towers of the west facade. So this is the south elevation, or the south side of the church. Three separate sections. Yes?
Yeah, if they didn't know how to make concrete, what did they use between the stones?
They did use mortar. They did have a kind of very sort of flimsy mortar, but they didn't have. It wasn't a lime-based mortar, so they didn't have the cohesive strength of concrete. There was no way that they could build any. It was essentially cement. It was made with a very fine, small aggregate and water, and it didn't have the consistency and the strength and the large pieces of Roman concrete. So they did have different kinds of mortars that they used. If we look at the interior, this is again just a view, a close-up shot of the nave taken from the aisle. The photograph is taken standing here in the aisle, looking up into the nave, which runs in this direction. The length of the nave runs in the direction that here that my hand is going here. The church is again divided into parallel, a nave and two side aisles. It's the same nave here, side aisles here, another one on the other side. This is going to be a common theme. But they are partitioned. They're divided very differently than the church that we just looked at. Barrel vaults are used here, but barrel vaults are placed transversely. They're turned 90 degrees. So there's one barrel vault here. There's another barrel vault here. There's another barrel vault here. They're placed, instead of being along the length of the nave, they're turned 90 degrees, and they're placed one next to another. And this is the way that they cap the nave. They are all buttressed against each other. This one buttresses against the next one, which buttresses against the next one. They all support each other. And so they solve this problem here of how to buttress or how to support the barrel vault. And what this does is it leaves this space open. This part of the wall has no structural function. And so you could open a window there. And this was the way of allowing more light into the church. So does everybody see that? Is that clear? Instead of having a long barrel vault that runs like this, they turned them. And on each individual, let's say, bay, because they're beginning to compartmentalize the nave, they place an individual vault. This kind of compartmentalization is continued in the aisle. This is the aisle of the church. And here is a groin. You can see there are two barrel vaults intersecting. They form these X lines. This is a groin vault. And each bay or each unit is now vaulted with this one groin vault here, another one here, separated by these large, what we call transverse bands. So you get this beginning here of this modular division, dividing the space into a series of units. And this is one of the keys of medieval architecture. They don't have the large undivided spaces that the Romans use. They divide the spaces into individual units, individual spatial units. Again, exteriors vary. There are all different kinds of exteriors of Romanesque churches. This is an example in Burgundy, in northeastern France. It's located, it's an abbey church, again, a monastic church. It's located in the town of Paray-le-Monial, P-R-A-Y, new word L-E, new word M-O-N-I-A-L. And it was built between 1100 and 1130. This is a view from the northwest. So what you're looking at here is the west facade. Here, two towers mark the west facade. Here is the nave right behind. Here is the lower aisle. Clear story windows. There's a larger tower at the back. The larger tower marks the crossing of a nave with this other section of the church that's placed perpendicularly, and that's called the transept. We have the nave and the transept. Each part of the church is clearly identified. Each section, you could stand outside and you could tell, if you knew medieval churches, you could tell what it is, what was on the inside, what the kind of space was on the inside. The east end of the church, the area where the altar was located, is called a chevet. This whole thing is called a chevet. Well, not the cars, but the rest of it, minus the cars. It's always impossible to take photographs in France. They park everywhere. Called a chevet, C-H-E-V-E-T. And a chevet is made up of different component parts, and made up of the apse. This is our old friend, the apse, we've seen before, right here. This is the space underneath which the altar is located. There's a lower space that curves around the apse. This is called an ambulatory. It's where you ambulate.
Okay, see the church, the one you saw from France, that's supposed to be a Romanesque building, but it has a pointed arch.
Yeah, well, some of the Romanesque buildings will have pointed arches. Very few, but some of them do.
Yeah, but so my question was, how can you differentiate it from the Gothic?
Well, you'll see by the end of today. If you see by the end of today's lecture, it should be very clear, because the Gothic the structure becomes a skeleton. It's extremely thin. You'll be able to. It'll be obvious by the end of the lecture. So, apse, ambulatory. Right? This is where this is a space that went around the apse, and the apse contained the altar. It contained the relic of the saint. So it was the space around. You could walk around, and you could actually view the relic from behind without disturbing the mass. That was the point of having an ambulatory. And then there are all these little chapels, radiating little small chapels around the ambulatory, also part of the whole thing that's called a chevet. These were for subsidiary altars and subsidiary relics. Churches tried to get as many relics as possible. The more relics, the more prestige, the more money, the more you could get people to come and visit the church, visit your city. If you could get people to come visit the church, they would make donations. So all these little chapels that you see on the outside are all full of relics of other saints, not the main saint to whom the church is dedicated, but other saints, all with their own altars. If we look at the inside, again, they're difficult to see, but the bay system here is in evidence. Here's an example. There is a slightly pointed arch here. Builders do use, especially in this area of France and Burgundy, they use pointed arches. But this barrel vault, that's a slightly pointed barrel vault, divided by these arches. These arches extend down into the wall. They divide up the wall. They divide up the space. They compartmentalize the space. And this is echoed on the exterior here by these lines here, these sections of stone, which are called wall buttresses. And behind every wall buttress here, if you went into the interior, you would find one of these bands. So there's a connection, there's a coordination. There's between the inside and the outside of the building. You can tell from the inside what the outside is going to perhaps be, and if you're on the outside, you can guess what the inside, how the inside is going to be organized, how the interior space is going to be organized. Then I'll just introduce Normandy before we take a break. Normandy is the region along the English Channel in northern France, which was occupied since the early 10th century by Norsemen, who are otherwise known as Vikings, if you've heard of the Vikings. The height of their kingdom was in the 11th and the 12th centuries under the rule of a very ambitious duke, Duke William, who's also known as William the Conqueror, who in 1066 crossed the English Channel and conquered England. And he became King William the First of England. Norman architecture, it will be, as we'll see, will be imported to England at this time. There's going to be we'll see a connection. What you're looking at is a Norman church. But I'll show you an example of Norman architecture in France, and then I'll show you an example of Norman architecture in England. Because with when the English conquer, or when the Normans conquer England, they import Norman architecture. They take their architecture with them. The Normans were great builders, very, very sophisticated builders. They employed a very fine local white limestone, which is unfortunately difficult to see here in this church. This is a church in the city of Caen, C-A-E-N, in Normandy. This is the Church of St. Stephen that was built for William the Conqueror. White limestone, very well cut stone blocks, what we call ashlar construction, squared stone construction, A-S-H-L-A-R. Facade is very clearly articulated, very clearly divided, clearly divided up by these, first of all, these pier buttresses into three separate divisions, vertical divisions, divided by these windows into horizontal divisions, topped by two towers here that are flush. The stone is flush with the rest of the facade. This is the entry facade, the west facade. The stone is flush with the facade. The exterior tells you exactly what to expect on the interior, and this is called a twin tower facade. This type of facade is called a twin tower facade. So I think what I'll do is we'll take a break, and we'll start with this and then move into Gothic during the second hour. It's like an hour and a half.